is to do our land acknowledgement. And that is, we honor the land as the Creator intended, in that we commit to keep it clean and support efforts to make it safe for all. We can show honor to the native keepers of the land by recognizing the value of their culture, by learning the truth of their history and how it shaped this great country. So as Elijah said, today we have another wonderful speaker. I can't wait. I'm looking forward to what our speaker has to share with us. And in preparation, I went out and I did a quick Google, or at least I went on Twitter actually, full disclosure. And over 1,300 folks actually responded to a question on how they pronounce this word, Latinx. And 42% said they pronounce that word Latinx. Almost 46% said they pronounce the word Latinx. And almost 6% say they pronounce the word Latinx. And there was a little over 6% that pronounced the word some other way. They didn't give those other words. So today you signed up because you were coming to listen to Latino, Latina, Latinx, or Tink, gendered languages and our gendered lives. This talk focuses on the debate raging over recent years about the term Latinx. Its use and reactions to its use differ across contexts, from the attitudes of English speakers versus Spanish speakers to its currency in US versus Latin American spaces, also to its values to communities of activists, policymakers, scholars, and artists. The talk will create a safe space for open inquiry and will invite participants to engage in the topic productively and inclusively. And as Elijah will remind you later, please use that Q&A box to chart your questions, because our speaker today will be open to responding to them. So a little bit about our speaker, Ricardo Ortiz. He's an educator, a professor of US Latinx literatures and cultures at Georgetown University's Department of English. He has earned his MA and his Ph.D. from the University of California and his BA in English and Economics from Stanford University. Before coming to Georgetown, he held positions at San Jose State University and Dartmouth College. He was appointed to the Committee on the Literature of People of Color for the Modern Language Association and served as a co-chair of the Washington, D.C. Area Site Committee for the 2018 National Meeting of the Latino Studies Association, working with colleges, universities, as well as the Smithsonian Institute to bring 500 scholars of US Latino studies to the nation's capital. He has over 30 years in higher education. Professor Ortiz has published 2 books and many articles and chapters on Latinx, literature and cultural engagements of gender, sexuality, and class. Please, let's give a warm welcome to Professor Ortiz.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here, and I hope this is all working. So I just, first of all, want to thank Fanny and Elijah for the invitation and for the pleasure and the honor of sharing some thoughts with your community. This is just something I've been looking forward to since I was invited, and I'm really looking forward to what happens in the next hour. I also just want to acknowledge Fanny's use of a Twitter post to get us started and to talk about even how we pronounce Latinx and how there may not be any consensus about how we do that. That's actually an interesting thing that I'll probably talk about a little bit later. But for now, I'll just make the joke that when the term first started to bubble up in people's consciousness, which is about 7 or 8 years ago, I think not quite a decade yet. I remember being a little bit of a kind of smart aleck on social media and going after that pronunciation question, like, do we pronounce it like Kleenex? Is it Latinx? Is it, if it's Latinx, that sounds weird, and I don't know what does that rhyme with? Or, why the X and why not something else? Why not a Y? Because in Spanish, the Y is the word for and that conjoins things as opposed to sort of separating things the way that the X might. So that we would be Latini or Latini, that it's something that I think in some ways I'll use this as a way of kind of signaling my own approach to this question, which is that it's really, I'm pretty agnostic about it. I understand why it's working and I understand its uses, and I don't have objections to it, at least not any personal ones. But I understand why other people do, and I think that that's an important conversation to have. But for the purposes of this discussion, I'm not here really necessarily to advocate for anything, but I'm more here to share some thoughts, provide maybe some history that might help others have a clear example of what this term has been doing and why some people use it and why some people don't, and where we can go from here, what lessons this can teach us, but also what direction this might give us for anything we'd want to do, either with this word or the questions that it raises for the future. So first of all, I shared with Fanny and Elijah an article that came out in the Washington Post just a week plus ago. It was not this past weekend, but the weekend before. And if you have a Post account, if not, I sent a PDF of it to them so that they have it to share if anybody would like to see it. It's very typical of the kind of national media coverage that the question of Latinx is receiving these days, and it's been receiving it for a while. It's been a number of years. A lot of this debate goes back certainly before COVID to that world that we were living in that period in the late sort of 20-teens. But it seems to just sort of has carried over into the post-COVID era, pretty much intact, pretty much is the same debate, I think, that we've been having for a number of years now. And, it makes sense in a lot of ways that there would be a debate and that there would be a kind of hesitation on the part of some people to have anything to do with the word. And in some cases, maybe even some strong objection or hostility to it. So just by way of my own sort of personal history, so you know a little bit more about who I am after Fanny's beautiful introduction of me. I'm an immigrant. I was born in Cuba in 1961 and came to the US with my family when I was 5 years old in 1966. And rather than settle in South Florida, in Miami, we went to Southern California, and I was raised in this Latino working class immigrant suburbs of LA. I call the area where I grew up East LA. So, I grew up in a really rich and interesting, rich in culture and rich in many things, but not rich in means, not rich in wealth by any stretch of the imagination. My parents worked in factories all their lives. We were very much a part of the kind of working class immigrant Latinx, I'll say at this point, community that we landed in that remarkable part of the world and that remarkable part of the country way back when in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And of course, at that point, nobody could have imagined that we'd get to a point here where there'd be a term like Latinx to describe the communities and the histories that we're talking about here. So, starting in the 1960s and the 1970s, as part of the wave of historical and cultural and intellectual change that came about because of the civil rights movement, spearheaded, of course, by the African-American civil rights movement, but increasingly involving movements for rights and equality and inclusion on the part of other excluded ethnic, racial, and sexual minorities. There came by the late 1970s to be formations beyond the political realm, but beyond the activist realm, in the realm that I'm in, which is higher education, in the realm of academic work and scholarly study, fields that at that point were originally called Chicano and Latino studies, Puerto Rican studies in the in the Northeast, and a number of other sort of fields that started to coalesce. There wasn't really anything like Cuban American studies yet at that point. But at some point, because of the sense that there was a national trend going on, and it wasn't just Mexican American studies on the West Coast and the Southwest, and mainland Puerto Rican studies in the Northeast, but something national was happening that was going to eventually include Cuban Americans, and after that, Dominicans and Central Americans and other communities of immigrants from Latin America who were coming to this country and starting to establish themselves, settle themselves, and interact with the rest of the United States, with the rest of our social fabric, that there needed to be a more inclusive term, a more descriptive term for all of us all at once in some kind of general sense, right? And so there was a kind of a hot moment in the 1970s when the term that was really most current was Hispanic. And Hispanic was a term that the US Census Bureau started to use to try to count us in the census. But from the very beginning, people in academia, people who were sort of critical with the relationship of these immigrant communities, primarily immigrant communities, with the federal state and with federal state authority, thought that there was probably some good reason for us not to accept a term that was imposed on us and used to describe us from outside and from above, and to come up with a different term that might be something we would choose to call ourselves, and choose for a variety of sort of critical and important, compelling reasons. And the term that people settled on was Latino. And so there's a moment probably between the late 1970s, well into the 1980s, where Latino becomes the term of use. It takes on a kind of general national currency. And for a long time, it goes uninterrogated. And the term Latino was selected in part because it got us away, again, from that naming from the outside and from above, but also got us away from the sort of resonance of Hispanic, that Hispanic echoed Spanish too much and Spaniard too much, and seemed to imply that somehow we were very closely related to Spain as a country, maybe to Spanish as a language, as opposed to the fact that the historical relationship here, obviously, is the legacy of Spanish, Portuguese, Iberian colonialism in the Western Hemisphere in the New World that determined eventually, right, that well into the 20th century, most of the people living in the regions we're talking about spoke either Spanish or Portuguese, and had some sense of an inheritance from the European culture that colonized these regions and that set the terms for a lot of cultural life in those regions for the centuries that we're talking about. So Latino is a term that people were using, but not necessarily in this kind of official formal way, generally to describe themselves when you wanted to say, well, this is what we have in common as Latin Americans, whether you're from Mexico or Cuba or Puerto Rico or Brazil or Argentina or Chile or wherever else. And so Latino got used, got embraced. But when I was in, I went to college at Stanford in the late 70s, early 80s, started graduate school at UCLA in the mid 80s to early 90s. By that point, this field, this sort of intellectual field, this interdisciplinary field of Latino studies was well established, and went about its business to sort of start producing scholars and scholarly projects and bodies of knowledge about a community. Again, and Latino studies really does specifically name the study of the Latino experience in the United States, right? Latin America is Latin America. There are rich and long sort of histories of Latin American studies in the United States, obviously in the region and all over the world. But what I'm talking about primarily here is the kind of work happening in the US about Latinos in the US. So understanding our histories, when we can start to first understand a kind of Latino identity or Latino consciousness that was already in this country, or maybe here before this was this country, right? There are arguments to be made for the fact that there were Hispanics or people from Latin America already occupying spaces in English colonial America before the revolution and before the establishment of this country, but certainly by the 19th century, for lots of different reasons, often political, there were residents of the United States who hailed from these other spaces in the Western Hemisphere that we call Latin America, for lots of different reasons. So by the time you get to the 20th century, this is already, from the early 20th century, this is already a rich and varied and diverse community that's here within the territory of the United States, but identifying as hailing from the rest of the hemisphere, from the part of the hemisphere we call Latin America. So around, I would say, the late 1980s, early 1990s, with the emergence of gender studies, feminist studies, women's studies, and its influence in spaces, cultural spaces, linguistic spaces outside of English, it became clear that a critique of the term Latino was also starting to take hold, because while in Spanish, it's very much, it's been common, traditional, going back well into the past, that it's always the masculine term that also gets used to describe the general thing you're trying to describe. The people started to realize that Latino, yes, that could mean all Latinos, male and female, of any sort of gender identity, but it still could sound like you were just talking about male Latinos. And I'll stop here and just obviously sort of acknowledge that Spanish, unlike English, is a deeply gendered language, that all nouns are gendered, and that the gendering then has to sort of apply to modifiers, to the way that nouns are described by adjectives, and that it's not just people who are gendered, it's all objects that can be named that are gendered. And so everything is rendered either masculine or feminine. So, a table is una mesa, and that's a feminine object in the world, right? So, like a car in Cuban Spanish is a carro. A carro is un carro, and it's a masculine object for whatever reason. And that's just, it's not exclusively true of Spanish. There are many, many languages, all the Latin languages that derive from Latin are gendered, but it's not just that family tree. There are many, many languages in the world that for whatever reason decided to sort of just divide our reality into things that would be named as either masculine or feminine. So when we're starting to even try to discuss the deep and complicated relationship that language is going to have to reality, both as something that describes that reality, but can also, if used in a certain way, influence that reality, perhaps even begin to shift and change that reality, you get some really interesting kinds of effects, but you also get, you raise a lot of interesting questions. So it was the case that by the 1990s, the field that I'm in, Latino studies, began to call itself Latino and Latina studies, or Latina and Latino studies, to make sure that we were being at least sort of gender inclusive in that way. And you can imagine that at this point, that gesture, that move, and it really did sort of take over the field, right? And within it, there would be offshoots. So if Mexican American studies, which was oftentimes called Chicano studies, saw this happening, and in a way they were I would say the leaders in this, that Chicano and Chicana scholars, feminist scholars in particular, started to demand that field be named Chicana and Chicano studies, and that became a cue really for the larger field for Latina and Latino studies to follow suit. So that gets us to the 1990s. That gets us really pretty much to the turn in the millennium. And let me say, I'll take a step back here and say that Latino studies, Latina studies is interdisciplinary. I work in literature. My degrees are in English, but I'm really a literature and culture scholar. So I primarily teach, novels and poems and plays, and when I want to, because it's fun, I can do film and popular music and a number of other sort of like genres of popular culture. But Latino studies includes political scientists, it includes linguists, it includes sociologists and historians. Oftentimes those of us working in Latina studies, our work cuts across a number of different categories. And so, for example, Fanny said that I work sort of at the intersection of gender, sexuality, and class. And of course, I would add in there culture and ethnicity, but that's what Latina names, right? That it's a really rich field, and it's a really great place to have conversations with people with training other than your own, right? So that I love being in the same room with really smart historians or really smart sociologists, folks or art historians, folks who really know these other dimensions of the culture that I study and that I love to teach to my students, and that I love to write scholarship about from perspectives that aren't my own. So there's a deeply intersectional, interdisciplinary quality to Latino and Latina studies that I want to mark here because I think it's important too. But as we keep sort of marching through the years and through the decades, the next development that happened that's important to notice here is that because of all the amazing work that feminist studies, that women's studies did on the very question of gender, on the very question of what really constitutes gender, and especially interrogating the question of what constitutes a femininity that's always been defined by patriarchy. And there's an offshoot of that I'll say, obviously the other emergence that's happening around this time is the emergence of queer studies in particular. So gay and which started as gay and lesbian studies, became lesbian and gay studies, and included bisexuality and transgenderism sort of at the, as it went along, and the LGBTQ moniker got longer and acquired more letters. In addition to the sort of critique of gender coming from what feminists and women's studies, there was also a critique of the relationship of gender to sex, gender to desire, gender to the other forms of sexual life that we inhabit, and that are deeply politicized and that mark us, place us on, in the sort of the political space of power and hierarchy in the places that we're located in or rendered in because of the way that we identify ourselves, or the way that we're identified by the world, that a kind of confluence begins to happen, and where people start to take a step back and think, okay, well, and again, I'm just talking about Latina here because this is the subject of this talk, but this is something that could happen across multiple spaces where the gendering of language creates this question about, well, if we're starting to get away from the attitude or the position that gender is only binary and there are only two terms that gender can speak in, and one is masculine and one is feminine, but that instead, indeed, we need a much more fluid and multiple and versatile conception of gender that allows for probably an infinite number of possible other ways of being gendered or not being gendered, or rejecting a kind of gendering of yourself in the way that you want to live your life, that we need a more versatile and pliant language to start to do that work, so that it's not inevitable that the only way we can be named and the only way we can name others in the course of what we're doing situates us only on one side of a pole or the other. That somehow we need to think about this as a kind of a much more vast and varied multiverse of gendered ways of being, or even ways of being outside of gender. They're still about our bodies and about our sexuality and about the way that we present in the world and the way that we want to be seen and heard and understood and respected in the world. So there's a lot that's happening here. There's a lot that sort of starts to kind of converge, as I was saying, in the course of, especially, I'd say the years jumping from the late 1990s into the new millennium. And I've focused at this point, because this is the subject of the talk, obviously, on gender, sexuality, the gendering of language, and the name of the field that I'm in. I'll take a step back here and say, on the one hand, so The other thing that's happening in Latino, Latina, and now I'll say, you know, as we're starting to understand that it can also be called Latinx studies, there's been an increasing attention. It's been there from the beginning, but it starts to really take hold and starts to really become more central than it was in the past. Of our sort of interrogating our own assumptions about the way that Latino, Latina, Latinx works as a way of naming race and ethnicity, because that continues to be another topic of debate, that it's not really enough. It's not, it doesn't really settle all the concerns and all the questions people have, that Latino, Latina, Latinx, you know, yes, it signals that we're talking about people, communities, cultures that originally hailed from this place called Latin America, and that come to live and survive and hopefully thrive in this North American, you know, United Statesian, you know, estadounidense space. But at the same time, it doesn't really tell us a lot about the racial and ethnic diversity of the people that are named by the category. And so there's been a lot more attention over the course of the last couple decades on the racial and ethnic diversity of the term that we use often to sort of in Spanish as the kind of noun to talk about Latino-ness or Latinx-ness is Latinidad. There's not really a word in English that does that work. So I may from now on sort of refer to Latinidad, and I hope that you'll understand that that's what I mean by it. But Latinidad is itself a really weird racial category because in a sense, it's meant to say that we're somehow racially distinct or ethnically distinct or culturally distinct in our being Latino, Latina, Latinx, at the same time that within that term, we're distinct from one another and bear with us a deep mixture, a deep complexity of difference across the races that we bear with us, whether we're Afro-Latinx or Indigenous Latinx, or in whatever other way, brown in a way that really can't be defined as anything other than Latinx. What we're not exclusively and not primarily is white, and what we're not exclusively and increasingly, you know, we think about these things, we're certainly not exclusively straight or cis, if we want to use the term for those of us who align ourselves more sort of neatly within the sort of binary logic of gender, whether we're cis masculine or cis feminine. And there are all these other ways that obviously Latinx, Latinidad can name a thing, but you really have to dig deep to find out like how and why it is that any given person might embrace that term and might want to use it to name themselves as much as they might invite others to use it to name them. So this movement that has been sort of going on now for a number of decades, I think has come to a kind of point of intensity and a kind of acute point of, debate in our present moment. I'll say again that you won't hear Latinx everywhere all the time being used for the same reasons or by the same people. And so it matters that there are places where it seems to have been accepted and embraced and sort of used, activated, not by everybody, but by enough people that it becomes important, right? To hear these voices and to know why they're coming from certain places. So for example, one of the origin stories of Latinx is that it did start online back in the aughts, back, you know, in the first decade of the 21st century by activists, not scholars, who were concerned about this question of gender inclusion and of wanting to find a way to work against or to really call into question the sort of just the presumptive binary gendering of everything in a language like Spanish. And that from those roots in online and then, you know, real world activism, a kind of, you know, a guild like mine, the academy, the scholarly set, who in our own way are always sort of interested in the ways that our work can not only help us to understand the world, but understand the best ways to change it and to make it better and do better by us, but also by another group that we care about a lot, which is our students and the world that they're going to go into and the one that they're going to help to make in generations to come. That academia, not universally and not equally across all spaces, but academia also started to embrace the term and to use it. So these days, generally speaking, it is not controversial for me to call my field Latinx studies, or for me to say that I'm a specialist in Latinx literature. To most of the people I would be saying this to. And in fact, I have so bought into the moment that in 2019, I published a book called Latinx Literature Now, that tries to understand sort of like what has happened with the writing by Latinx writers in the United States in the course of the 21st century. It's very much about our contemporary moment, although it's 2019, so it feels a little dated already. But it was important to me to use the term Latinx in the title of my book because it made sure that people understood that the work was happening in this era, in this political and historical period, in using that term. It's also now, I would say, if some of the roots of the use of Latinx really did sort of bubble up through the internet and through online discourse about 15 years ago, it's thriving there still, right? I think it's been driven by not all of social media, but a lot of social media, where it's a place where you'll see Latinx and people will be using it without any controversy and without any pushback. And it's also, I think, much more prevalent in culture, especially in popular culture. Maybe not so much in the sort of movies and TV shows that you're watching. And I don't know, maybe not even in popular music, but as a way that cultural artists talk about themselves and talk about how they identify when they're explaining their art and commenting on why they engage in the forms of expression that they do. So I think in some ways, the fact that there are places now that are legislating against the use of Latinx to the extent that they can, I don't prefer that happens, because I think in some ways that's it's unnecessary, and I don't necessarily see either the harm or offense in the way that Latinx is used. It's really not, from the people who are mostly embracing it and using it, it's really not meant to be offensive, and it's not meant to be hostile. It's meant to offer an alternative for people who might want to opt for a different way of looking at the world and of naming people and things that does sort of pause before just sort of taking for granted that everything can really be divided into these categories of masculine and feminine. I started this conversation, and I think at some point very soon, I will stop talking and invite questions from the rest of you. But for me, the dynamic that really matters here is that I don't think any of us who are using the term want to impose it on anyone else. And I think that a question that comes up here, and I think it might be one that we can talk about in our conversation, is that a lot of this really does boil down to the thing that I started talking about many minutes ago, which is that we live in this world as individuals, but we also live in this world where we identify with groups and communities that are the ones that we cherish and that we want to belong to, and that help us to live and that help us to thrive, and that give us a sense of who we are in the world and where we want to be in the future and how we'd like to contribute to that future. And so I'm always sort of in favor of doing that in a way that allows everyone to name themselves and to determine that this is the way that this is what they'd like to be called, this is how they'd like to be seen, this is how they'd like to be heard, and that requires a great deal of care and a great deal of vigilance and a great deal of openness on the part of all of us to understand why this might be happening. And I thought about sharing the Washington Post article. I think it does a pretty good job of being fairly neutral about things. But I think in general, a lot of our national discourse, a lot of our public discourse is using this occasion of the controversy around Latinx to celebrate division and to use division to divide and conquer, and to keep folks from really having the kinds of conversations we should be having about this stuff, which I don't think have to come down to either or. It's not a zero-sum game. This is really about all of us feeling at home in the same world. And that's where I want to be. I want to be in that world. And I don't think Latinx is doing anything necessarily to make that less possible, but I understand why some people don't choose it and don't feel called by that. And I think that's okay. That's how it should be. I'll stop there and welcome any questions that anyone might have. And it's a safe space, so please feel free to ask anything.
We do have some questions. And one of those, did you notice generational differences in the use of specific terms? You said something that sparked a question that could lead that there could be some generational differences in relationship to terms.
Yes, absolutely, there are generational differences. That's one. I think that is one of the key sort of factors in people determining whether they're comfortable with the term or not, is that if you've grown up your entire life without it, then it just doesn't have that same sort of relationship to your life, and you haven't been waiting to be liberated by the new term. So again, there's just a way that I want to honor the sort of the authenticity and the genuineness of people's lived experiences, and that's one way to sort of to approach this. So I think it's really understandable that it's not as familiar and maybe not as attractive to older folks than it might be to younger folks. But these generational differences track across a lot of other things. So it's not just the openness to Latinx. It's what that tells us about openness to other forms of lived experience and freedom of expression and everything else that comes along with that.
Absolutely. We have other questions here. And one is, how do you deal with those who do not embrace the term?
Again, I think it's a question of the situation and the context, and so I haven't really ever been in a situation, I have to say, where somebody said, I don't use that term and I hate it. It's like, oh, okay, don't use it. I'm not going to force you to. That's not what I'm here to do. I'm going to use it, and you can tell me whether you find that offensive, but that hasn't happened. And so I think, and it's not like I don't use Latino when I need to, because I think sometimes, gender hasn't gone away. And so there are times when it sort of matters that you say, I need to mark my positionality in the world as a man and as a fairly cis man, and as a queer man. And so there are all these different ways that I sort of understand that that's going to happen. And I sometimes will say Latino studies when I want to say a certain thing. But I just don't find myself in those debates. And so again, I think that they're very unlikely to happen in academia and don't happen in my classroom very much. Again, but not because I'm intimidating my students or anything. They can say anything they want, and we'll deal with what they're saying and try to understand what that means. But I spend my core original community is mostly Cubans in Southern California who came to this country when they were about my parents' age, right? They were in their 20s in the 1960s, so they're into their 80s now. They mostly speak Spanish to one another. They're mostly talking about being Cuban, being Cuban in one way or another. And I can, in Spanish, I don't say Latinx. I mean, maybe this is something I could have said a little bit more in my remarks. I think it does sort of jar a little bit more in terms of how you hear Spanish to say Latinx, because Latinx feels to me like an English word. But that doesn't mean that you can't use it as a Spanish speaker. It just means that you're going to hear it differently as a Spanish speaker. In English, Latinx already kind of rolls off the tongue in a way, right? Because I'm just so familiar with it now and so used to it. But no, I would say that my conversations about this, really, they just haven't been contentious. They've been open.
Here's a question, and this individual states, I like to identify as Mexican American. I don't like Latina because my roots are not from Latin America. And like you said earlier, Hispanic, to me says that I identify as coming from Spain. How do you feel about that? And how have you found that in others?
Yeah, no, it's such an important part of the history of what we're doing here, right? That you have to do this. Uh I've been teaching this thing that I call Latina, Latinx literature at Georgetown for 30 years. But I know that again, nobody sort of feels like they come from a place called Latin America and that's the most important thing. They mostly really want to talk about where their family comes from in terms of the country that they came from. And that there's a lot of sort of national pride in that, and that's part of the mix. That's part of everything we're talking about here. So, like I said, I growing up as a Cuban kid in a Mexican world, in Southern California, where my parents lived in a neighborhood where all our neighbors spoke Spanish, but they spoke a different Spanish. um, that was part of, on the one hand, I would say, yeah, that was a Latino experience because we weren't all from the same country. So I can use that term to say that. But the fact is that, I lived in a really Cuban house where we ate Cuban food and listened to Cuban music and drank a lot of Cuban coffee. And my friends from school who were primarily Mexican American, Chicano, Chicana, we could speak Spanish to one another, but they ate really different food and listened to really different music and had a really different, and drank really different coffee. But that mattered. Like, that wasn't something that we ignored. It was actually part of what made it interesting to be us in that environment. And so, no, I think that it's really built into like the work that I do, that I can't teach a course and just say, well, we're just reading Latinx stuff. It's, the minute that you open a book, read a poem or look at the situation of any of the writers that I'm teaching in a class like the kind that I teach, you're already talking about, well, this is about this particular sort of Mexican American community in a place like El Paso, right? Or this is about a particular kind of Dominican experience in in New York City. And that's how you do it. And that's vitally important. So the whole like Latino, Latina, Latinx discourse that we're mostly talking about here, it's important, it's useful, but it's kind of a shorthand, but it's also just a necessary kind of umbrella term. But I never stay right on that level. It's really always about the specificity of the histories and the communities of the people that we're reading about.
Mm, mm, mm. Well, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on these two questions because you might have gone into that space already. This is from someone from New York City, and there's a term Afro-Latino. Have you heard that term? As part of the mix of students that this individual work with, and it goes on to say the Afro-Latinx, something that is used. And what is it? I work with people from the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, DR and PR. So are those popular terms that you've heard?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, no. It's I think I sort of buried that point in talking about that sort of critique of Hispanic, right? That it was in a sense really literally too white. And it didn't allow for the racial diversity of Latinos to breathe. And again, I think Latino, Latinx sort of does that a little bit, but it doesn't do it enough, right? And so at some point you do have to dig into the specificity of what it means to be Black in Latinx, what it means to be Indigenous in Black and Latinx, what it means to be mixed race and all these other ways in Latinx. And so yeah, no, it's central to the way that Latino studies sort of thinks about itself, that we're always sort of interrogating our own assumptions about the racial makeup of our community, of our group, and the places where the growth and interest is the highest and the most intense and the most exciting right now is definitely in thinking more about and centering more the experiences and the histories of Latinos of color in all the work that we do. I've never taught a course in my 30 years at Georgetown where every writer or the majority of writers were white.
Okay. So, oh, these are some interesting comments that are being placed in the chat box. So I'm jumping back and forth. Elijah, you can jump in at any point if I miss some good questions. And this is someone who wrote that the Latinos, um, the, uh, the Latinos, because the Spanish language, wait a minute, don't go away. I got to pull this back up because it kind of like disappeared there for a moment. Can you see that question? I mean, that comment, Elijah, because it kind of disappeared on my screen.
Absolutely. I think you're talking about the comment that says, I feel that Latinx is not representing Latinos. I said Latinos because the Spanish language is the root of Latin. So whether you are from the Caribbean, Central America, South America, or Spain, what unites us is that we speak Spanish, not Latinx.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a really great point. And again, this is the complexity of the thing that we're talking about, right? So on the one hand, and yes, so I couldn't speak a word of English until I was 5 years old, until I got to this country and started my education here. And I flipped at some point. It became more of a kind of English is my first language, and Spanish is now my second language. Unfortunately, it's just a thing that happened along the way. But yes, as I said before, I don't think that Latinx sounds at all sort of as organic or as natural when you sort of try to say it as, in conversations where you're speaking in Spanish. And it is true that, for example, we forget about how prevalent a language Spanish is in the United States. And so this does affect a lot of people. I'll get this statistic wrong a little bit, right? But it's the United States is either the second or third largest country of Spanish speakers in the world, right up there with Spain and Mexico. So, and I hear all the time these complaints about how Hollywood doesn't represent Latinos enough, right? And that there's not enough, of us in sort of popular media in the United States. And the only reason people can make that argument is because they're not watching anything in Spanish. That there is a massive network of Spanish entertainment in Spanish in this country where we see ourselves represented all the time. It's just that it's that English language space where we're badly underrepresented. And when we are represented, it's usually badly. So because we're not the ones making the decisions about the kinds of stories and the kinds of representation that are happening. So this is the complexity of the space that we're in. And I guess, what I would say is, that I think it behooves those of us who are using Latinx not to claim that it's the only way to name everybody that we're trying to describe using that term, and that we don't really want to impose it on anyone who doesn't, like I said, feel called by it or named by it, or seen through it, right? That I don't see any reason to banish it, and I don't think it's going away anytime soon, if ever at all. But I also don't want to use it as a weapon against anyone, and I don't want to use it to impose something on someone that they don't want.
This is slightly different. There's a question being asked that OMB is getting ready to update race and ethnicity statistical standards, and they're thinking of combining the race and ethnicity question. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm a literature scholar. And I won't hide behind that, but I'll say that it's a necessary evil. We need to figure out the most effective and scientifically, I guess, legitimate ways of doing this kind of demographic work, because it matters so much when it comes to the kind of policy making and the kind of decision making that can really sort of condition our lives. That this stuff happens. I don't imagine a time when they're going to get all of this right. That it's always going to be a work in progress, in part because, again, there are limitations to the way that these scientific methods can work, but it's also because we keep changing as people. And we don't stay one thing all the time. We're not actually built to be that bedrock in the way that we go into the world and make what we make of ourselves. So yeah, we need this stuff. We need this stuff to happen, and we need government to step in and do what it can. But I just can't imagine why I would ever assume or expect that it's actually going to get things super duper right. And that's why we have to keep our eyes on this stuff and make sure that smart people are looking at it and realizing that, you know, it's always going to call for criticism, and it's always going to call for a better job next time.
You know, you said something very interesting about it's almost as though that there are certain behaviors, certain acts that almost is trying to incite division amongst a group of people. And here's a question, and this, well, it was in the chat, and it says, is there an ethnic hierarchy amongst the different groups? Latina, Latino, Latinx, and if so, how much does that contribute toward clashing ideas regarding identity?
Yeah, yes, I would say that the basic answer to that question is yes. And again, it just goes back to the fact that this is such a diverse and such an internally complicated community that we have to be careful about the ways that we make generalizations about us, but we also have to understand that there are these hierarchies and these divisions that we experience, and that work for some of us a lot better than they work for others. And so, and they cut across a lot of different sort of dynamics of life, right? So, for example, just demographically, the vast majority of Latinos in the US are people of Mexican descent. I don't know how much more that plurality or that majority, that demographic, I don't know if I'd even call it an advantage, but it's just a fact that happens to be the case, is one marker. Another is that, you know, because of the conditions that led to migration from a lot of different countries in Latin America, and I'll use obviously my own example of Cuban Americans. Many of the Cubans who came over in the 1960s after the revolution were middle class and wealthy, and established themselves in Miami and grew their wealth there, and really sort of took over that part of the world politically and economically, and that influence is sort of you know, morphed into cultural influence on a number of different levels, and especially in terms of the Cuban influence over Spanish language media networks in the United States. And then locally in other, you know, in different places, if you're the majority there, you do have a kind of, if you want to call it an advantage, or a sense that your voice is going to be heard before another group's voice might be heard, right? And so the historical sort of longevity of Puerto Ricans in New York, right, over other Latino communities in New York, or the longevity of Mexican Americans in Southern California, all of those matter. I think all of those are part of the mix of the thing that we're talking about. But again, I think it's really up to us to decide. And again, well, let me put another one on the table. Obviously, if you're white in this country, and you go through the world presenting as white, or presenting as male, or presenting as cis, presenting as straight, you're going to enjoy advantages in a country and in a society and a culture that's still set up to favor people who present that way. And so all of these are embedded in the community we're talking about. And I think it's just up to all of us to figure out, both individually, but in the ways that we organize and the ways that we understand ourselves to sort of exist in these contexts, to do everything we can to not to take these hierarchies for granted, not to merely exploit our advantage when we enjoy those advantages, and to do everything we can to make this a better place for everybody.
Agreed. Professor Ortiz, I can tell you right now, this was, excuse me, this was absolutely fabulous. And in the last 3 minutes that we have, I can tell from the comments in the chat box and the questions that are asked that we need to engage in more conversations around this topic, and mainly because our industry, we serve our future.
You do.
We
Yeah.
serve our future. And if we don't get it right, it will impact our future because it will impact these little ones. And so I can't begin to thank you enough for coming and sharing your wealth of knowledge. I'm always impressed with our presenters, but I was particularly impressed with the fact that you had no PowerPoint. You just sat and you just started talking. And I said, oh, he is truly a professor, and with no PowerPoint. But I know for a fact that this is just the beginning, and we need to dig a little deeper and have more conversations. I don't believe that there can be a problem without a solution. I believe that. I truly believe that. So I believe if we put our heads together, we can start understanding each other more and start coming up with solutions, because we are the answer for our future. We are the answer to our future. Thank you so very much. And I truly hope that we could have you come back. Do you have a last word you'd like to share with all of us?
Yes, thank you. No, Fanny, again, thank you for the honor of this experience. So I started my own story by saying that I came to this country and landed here as a 5-year-old, and just understand my life as I'm still that 5-year-old in everything I do, and I never forget that kid. And what made this possible now that I can stand here as the person I became is exactly because of the way that I was cared for and supported by the people who took care of me, and especially my teachers. From the very first day I landed in school. Her name was Miss Taylor, my kindergarten teacher in Rosemead, California. And she took me by the hand and, led me into the rest of my life the day I arrived. So
Wonderful.
Thank you.
No, thank you. And we hope that you will consider coming back. And for all of you attendees, thank you so much for joining us. You could have spent your hour anyplace else, but you chose to spend it with us. And for that, we say thank you very much and have the best day ever. Thank you.
Thank you. Have me back whenever.
Yes.
Okay, bye. Thank you all so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.